Кирикяне. И сейчас я предоставляю слово министру иностранных дел Бахрейна, его превосходительству господину Абдел-Латифу бен Рашиду Аз-Заини. Прошу вас.
In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, Your Excellency, the President of the Council, Your Excellencies, Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished attendees, at the outset, I would like to express my sincere appreciation for devoting this meeting to discussing the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. And I thank you for inviting me to speak before the Council on behalf of my country, the Kingdom of Bahrain, which presides over the current session of the League of Arab States. Mr. President, over the past decades, the Middle East region has suffered from destructive wars, conflicts, and bitter conflicts, which have caused great loss of lives, of property, and infrastructure, which have left behind painful humanitarian tragedies and violated international laws and conventions. They have become a major threat to regional security and stability.
Hezbollah is also prepared to join the fray and warns of its readiness to fight back against invasion. In Syria, the Israeli air forces have multiplied attacks across the country, including areas in Damascus, Aleppo, Latakia, and the Golan Heights. The strikes have hit key airports and a seaport that played an important role in delivering urgent humanitarian aid, including as part of the response to last year's devastating earthquake. Dear colleagues, ending the violence in Gaza and the West Bank can create conditions not only for finding a lasting solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but also for tackling other crisis hotspots throughout the vast expanse of the Near and the Middle East in accordance with Security Council resolutions, rather than certain geopolitical ambitions or rules that the West attempts to use to replace the UN Charter. An important role in upholding the rights of the Palestinian people is, of course, played by Pan-Arabic and organizations whose activities we support, as we support the efforts of all truly responsible members of the global community. I would like to particularly note the importance of the Gulf states now after the extraordinary elections in Iran and the initial statements of the new Iranian president, Mr. Pezeshkian. There's hope for rapprochement among all the countries of the Gulf coasts in the interests of overcoming long-standing differences and mistrusts and joining efforts on a mutually acceptable basis in order to determine the parameters of their own mutual security without external interference, and to speak with one voice to realize the aspirations of the Palestinian people and generally build an architecture of stability and good neighborliness in the region. Progress on the Palestinian track in full compliance with UN decisions, progress in normalizing relations between the countries of the Gulf Coast, all of this would be an important contribution to the objective process of forming a common Eurasian architecture based on the principles of indivisibility of security and equal collective responsibility, mutual respect, and a balance of interests. I resume my function as the President of the Council, and I now give the floor to Special Envoy in the Middle East and North Africa of Switzerland, His Excellency, Mr. Wolfgang Amadeus Brühlhardt.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would like to thank Mr. Rattray for his presentation. Excellencies, Switzerland is alarmed by the situation throughout the occupied Palestinian territory and on both sides of the blue line between Israel and Lebanon. We must work tirelessly to restore peace and security in the Middle East. Switzerland has strongly condemned the acts of terror and hostage-taking perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October. These acts were followed by a deadly war in Gaza and unprecedented levels of violence in the West Bank. During a recent trip to the region, I saw once again the extent of the suffering inflicted on civilians on both sides. They continue to pay the heaviest price for violations of international law committed by all sides. This includes thousands of children killed or maimed. Furthermore, the lack of implementation of the 4 resolutions adopted by this Council since the 7th of October is unacceptable. We must step up our efforts to break the spiral of violence and return to the principles of humanity that have been flouted for too long in this conflict. Switzerland calls for an immediate ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. We encourage the parties to conclude and implement an agreement to this effect as quickly as possible. We thank the mediators for their tireless efforts. All persons deprived of their liberty must be treated humanely and receive visits from the ICRC. Humanitarian access must be provided through all possible crossing points in a safe, rapid and unhindered manner throughout the Gaza Strip. The situation is urgent. 96% of civilians are at risk of starvation according to the IPC. This is unacceptable. The civilian population, persons who are hors de combat, and civilian property, such as residential buildings, schools and buildings, must not be attacked. We condemn all attacks of this kind in the strongest possible terms, whether they take place in Gaza or elsewhere in the world. Respect for the principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution in the conduct of hostilities are obligations under international humanitarian law. And this applies even in the context of the fight against terrorism. In Resolution 2730, this Council reaffirmed the protection of personnel and property employed in humanitarian operations. Excellencies, a ceasefire in Gaza will make a major contribution to regional de-escalation. But it is not enough. To return to the path of peace, respect for international law in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is essential. To this end, Israel must refrain from taking measures that would introduce permanent changes, particularly demographic and administrative changes in the occupied territory. However, we note with concern the transfer of governance of civil affairs to the West Bank. In addition, recent announcements of the construction of housing units in the settlements. These contribute to the coercive environment. This leads to the forced displacement of Palestinian communities and the weakening of the Palestinian Authority. Settlements are illegal under international law. They are a major obstacle to peace and to the implementation of the solution of 2 democratic states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. Only a political solution will bring lasting peace to the Middle East. The way forward begins with respect for international law and dialogue between parties to the conflict, the states of the region, the members of this Council and other key players. My recent discussions in the region and beyond have confirmed to me that such a path requires the support of us all. And I repeat, of us all. Alongside you, Switzerland is ready to play its part in this difficult but necessary process, and to support any effort to reopen the way to peace. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Bullerhart for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, CDC Rattray, for your briefing on behalf of the SG. Colleagues, in 1950, Ralph Bunche won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work helping sow peace in the Middle East between Israel and its neighbors. And in his lecture in Oslo, he said something prescient, something that rings true 3/4 of a century later. He explained that, and I quote, "The world and its peoples being as they are, there's no easy or quick or infallible approach to a secure peace. It is only by patient, persistent, undismayed effort, by trial and error, that peace can be won," unquote. And this council knows well nothing about securing peace is easy, and progress is certainly not as quick as we all wish it would be. We see that in the ongoing talks for an immediate ceasefire with hostage release in Gaza. And yet, the United States, Qatar, Egypt, and so many of our other partners remain persistent. We have worked tirelessly to facilitate the deal this council endorsed in Resolution 2735, a deal that would bring about an immediate ceasefire with the release of hostages, would surge aid to Palestinians in need, and create a path to a longer-term peace and stability in the region. Colleagues, because of our unity, because this council was able to speak with one voice and back a concrete, realistic plan, there has been progress. Israel and Hamas have now both agreed to the ceasefire framework endorsed by the Council in Resolution 2735. There's still gaps to be closed, and this Council must keep pressure on Hamas to accept the deal outlined in Resolution 2735 and begin implementing it without delay and without conditions. This is what we all want here in this Council. It's what the Palestinians in Gaza want. But these negotiations are trending in the right directions, and we're working in close cooperation with Egypt and Qatar to get this deal done and bring an end to this war. It is also vital that the United Nations and humanitarian agencies have the resources and support needed to surge additional aid, some 600 trucks worth every single day, into Gaza as soon as that deal takes effect. Until then, it remains the United States' view that Israel must take additional immediate steps to eliminate barriers to the delivery of aid at scale. We thank those countries in the region, including Egypt and Jordan and Cyprus, who have enabled aid delivery to Gaza through their territory, and we hope all of them can do more to help meet the staggering need in this critical moment. While we've seen progress addressing long-standing requests from the United Nations and humanitarian organizations, other requests, particularly related to communications equipment vital for deconfliction processes, remain unresolved. We urge the government of Israel to work with the UN to overcome these and other roadblocks. Colleagues, Senior Coordinator Cog briefed us about the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. Palestinian civilians are living in hell. Over and over, they've had to flee from one place to another in search of safety. As the latest IPC report made devastatingly clear, hundreds of thousands live in fear that they won't be able to find their next meal. And so many people have lost parents and siblings, children and friends, including in a recent IDF strike on a UN-supported school in Nuseirat camp. Finalizing and implementing the ceasefire deal on the table is the best way to alleviate this suffering. We're also hopeful that a ceasefire in Gaza would assist diplomacy aimed at de-escalating the situation along the Blue Line, which is necessary to enable displaced people in Israel and Lebanon to return home. UNIFIL is playing an invaluable role in this work. We support a straightforward extension of its mandate and are prepared to immediately begin work on a narrow resolution toward that end. Hezbollah, of course, is not the only Iran-backed group in the region seeking to take advantage of the situation in Gaza to undermine regional peace and security. The Houthis continue to brazenly violate international law with their attacks on commercial and merchant vessels in the Red Sea that has affected all of us. These attacks must cease, and member states must stop arming and enabling the Houthis. We remain gravely concerned about the fate of the UN, diplomatic, private sector, and NGO personnel detained by the Houthis since early June. They must be released unharmed. Colleagues, while the world's eyes may be on Gaza, Lebanon, and the Red Sea, we cannot forget about the situation in the West Bank. We remain concerned by the significant uptick in deadly violence against Palestinian civilians by violent extremist settlers in the West Bank and condemn this activity in the strongest terms. Just last week, we announced another round of designations, naming 3 Israeli individuals and 5 entities connected to acts of violence against civilians or instability in the West Bank. We urge the government of Israel to take immediate steps to hold these individuals and other entities accountable. We also reiterate our concern over Israel's recent announcement expanding settlements, declaring expansive state lands, and legalizing outposts. Unilateral actions, like the government of Israel's settlement program, are inconsistent with international law and detrimental to a 2-state solution. We welcome reports that Israel will extend the correspondent banking relationship for 4 months and release a portion of the PA's clearance revenues. And we call on Israel to extend correspondent banking for at least 12 months, as well as release all of the withheld clearance revenues. The viability of the Palestinian Authority is essential to stability in the West Bank. Steps that weaken it only undermine Israel's security. Finally, we encourage Israel to join members of this council in supporting the PA's reform program. Colleagues, in the same Nobel lecture that I mentioned earlier, Ralph Bunche admitted that, and I'll quote again, "It's not easy to speak of peace with either conviction or reassurance," unquote. And yet, to speak of peace, to work toward peace, is urgently needed. And it is the task before every one of us in this council, not to point fingers, and certainly not to seed divisions. And so the United States remains steadfast in our efforts to pressure Hamas to take the steps necessary to close gaps at the negotiating table and finalize the ceasefire deal endorsed by this council, to bring the hostages home, including the 8 Americans still held by Hamas for over 280 days, to support humanitarian access into and across the entire Gaza Strip, and to meet the urgent protection needs of Gaza's most vulnerable, to promote regional security and continue to work toward a 2-state solution where Israelis and Palestinians alike can live in peace and in dignity, and to commit to patient, persistent, undismayed efforts so that peace can be won. Thank you.
Я благодарю.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the delegation of the Russian Federation for organizing this open debate and express my appreciation to Chef de Cabinet Rattray for the Secretary General's statement. Mr. President, the silence has been deafening on a possible solution to end the war in Gaza. Guyana had hoped that with the adoption of Resolution 2735 5 weeks ago, supporting the efforts of the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, that the bombs and bullets that continue to rain down on Gaza would have been silenced. We commend the United States, Egypt, and Qatar for their continued efforts and must remain optimistic. We, however, remind that it is the responsibility of this Council to continue to do all in its power to bring an end to this war. Mr. President, the multi-layered catastrophe in Palestine worsens with each passing day. The dimensions of this catastrophe stretch across every facet of Palestinian life, both in the Gaza Strip and the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Its principal characteristics are oppression and repression, indignity and impunity, destruction, deprivation, and death. Yet, even in their seemingly unending suffering, Palestinians look to the United Nations to bring this catastrophe to an end. Guyana's appeal, therefore, is for a collective mustering of political will to advance the peace process and to give the Palestinian people real hope of a secure and stable future. This is the only prospect which can equally secure a stable future for Israel and the Middle East. Mr. President, 9 months of Israel's barbaric war on Gaza has birthed a severely mutilated population, driven from corner to corner of the Strip, while bombs incessantly rain down on their severely weakened bodies. The death toll is now nearing 40,000, with the majority being women and children. What really is life in the Gaza Strip? Bombs, starvation, inadequate health care, and essential goods and services have seen the population being robbed of everything necessary for their survival. The continued impediments to the entry of humanitarian aid in contravention of legally binding decisions of the Security Council represent a complete disregard of international law obligations, particularly international humanitarian law. Guyana notes, for example, that though the Karam Shalom-Karam Abu Salem crossing is open, only a trickle of aid has entered through this crossing because there is an active combat zone between the crossing and the place where Palestinian civilians are residing. It is therefore nearly impossible to transport aid via this route. We must also recall that the overall security situation in the Gaza Strip remains precarious owing to the indiscriminate bombardment and the general breakdown of law and order, a breakdown entirely attributable to the desperation engendered by the prevailing circumstances. Mr. President, for months, we have seen targeted attacks against key civilian infrastructure, including healthcare facilities and schools. Refugee camps have not been spared. Indeed, attacks against camps have intensified. In recent weeks, Al-Mawasi, Burej, Nuseirat have all been attacked. Yet we hear that a ceasefire agreement cannot be reached due to red lines. What red lines are there that allow for the continuous killing of women and children and the bombing of schools, refugee camps, and hospitals? Guyana condemns this wanton violence in the strongest terms and calls on Israel to adhere to its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. We also demand that other UN member states uphold their duty to ensure that these obligations are upheld. The UN Charter and international legal instruments are not an a la carte menu from which we choose at our convenience. We are also seeing a ramping up of attacks against the UN, both in rhetoric and in physical bombardments, against UN staffers and facilities. UNRWA's facilities are being destroyed by Israel. 70% of UNRWA schools have been bombed. UNRWA's headquarters in Gaza have been decimated. Nearly 200 UNRWA staffers have been killed in this war. And the situation in the West Bank has also heated up considerably. Mr. President, this is an extremely dismal reality, and we must extinguish this inferno. Guyana calls for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and urges the parties to prioritize the protection of civilians as dictated by international law. We also call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages and Palestinians detained without trial in Israeli prisons. We urge adherence to the various resolutions of this Council. Guyana also calls for the scaling up of humanitarian assistance into Gaza. We stress in particular that the type of food assistance reaching the civilian population must be of high nutritional value, considering the dire state of food insecurity and nutrition. We underline the obligation of Israel as the occupying power to ensure that the population has access to humanitarian relief. We call on Israel to uphold this obligation and echo the demands of the International Court of Justice in this regard. Guyana further calls for the protection of UN and humanitarian personnel. The attacks on UNRWA must stop immediately, and functioning deconfliction and notification mechanisms must become operational. We also call for actions to reduce the tensions in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and to reduce the heightened violence between Palestinians and Israelis. We further call for good faith efforts aimed at reducing tensions in the region. In closing, Mr. President, a hitherto impoverished Gaza has been set back by many more years. The Council cannot afford to slip into malaise on the Palestinian question, but must continue to proactively work towards a permanent solution to the matter. The two-state solution remains the only viable option, and stringent efforts are needed, particularly by those with influence in the region, to move the needle on its implementation. Guyana is committed to doing its part to end what is perhaps the longest ongoing injustice against a people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. I thank you, Foreign Minister Lavrov, for presiding over today's meeting, and Chef de Cabinet Rattray for delivering the statement on behalf of Secretary General Guterres. Since its outbreak over 9 months ago, the Gaza conflict has caused over 38,000 civilian deaths, resulting in an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. The situation continues to deteriorate, with millions of Gazans repeatedly being forced to move. Schools and refugee camps have been under constant bombardment. The red lines of international law and international humanitarian law have been breached time and again. The international community must pool all its efforts to promote a ceasefire in order to save lives and alleviate the ongoing disaster without delay. An immediate and lasting ceasefire is a necessary precondition for saving innocent lives. When pushing for the adoption of Resolution 2735 within the Council, the United States repeatedly claimed that Israel had accepted the agreement. However, more than a month has passed. The Israeli military operations in Gaza have continued to expand, with recent attacks on several refugee camps, including Al-Mawasi and Nusrat, causing massive casualties. At this moment, what Gaza needs is a hope for peace. Military operations will only cause more casualties among innocent civilians. They will not create conditions conducive to the rescue of hostages. We urge Israel to immediately cease all military operations in Gaza and to stop the collective punishment of the people of Gaza. Countries with major influence should make earnest and responsible efforts to push the parties to come up with the political will to implement relevant resolutions of this Council. Expanding humanitarian access is an urgent need to ease the current situation. The humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza is a man-made disaster. Hunger should not be weaponized, nor humanitarian issues politicized. The closure of the floating pier has once again made it clear that land transportation routes are the most effective means to expand humanitarian access at scale, for which there's no. Humanitarian agencies, including UNRWA, have built the last lifeline for the people of Gaza. We condemn the attacks on humanitarian agencies and its personnel, and call for a thorough investigation of relevant incidents and seek accountability. China urges Israel to fulfill its obligations under international humanitarian law by lifting the blockade and opening all land crossings in Gaza so as to ensure a rapid, safe, and large-scale entry of humanitarian supplies and into Gaza and their safe and orderly distribution, while cooperating fully with the United Nations and other humanitarian actors. The two-state solution is the only viable way to resolve the Middle East question. Over the past decades, the Palestinian-Israeli situation has been repeatedly caught up in turmoil and tension. The root cause of it all is the fact that the two-state solution has not been implemented and the Palestinian people's national rights to independent statehood not guaranteed. Gaza is the Gaza of Palestine and the Gaza of the Palestinian people. Discussions on the post-war governance of Gaza must be based on reaching a political solution rather than adopting a piecemeal crisis management. It is vital to respect the will of the Palestinian people and address the legitimate concerns of regional countries. China firmly supports the establishment of an independent state of Palestine and the approach of a Palestine governed by Palestinians, and calls for the convening of a larger, more authoritative and more effective international peace conference and for establishing a concrete timetable and roadmap for the implementation of the two-state solution. President, the current conflict in Gaza is having a growing impact on the situation beyond its confines. The situation in the Middle East is increasingly precarious and worrisome. China calls on all parties to exercise calm and restraint, refrain from actions that exacerbate tensions, and work together to prevent a conflagration that could engulf the entire Middle East region. Together with others, China will continue to work tirelessly to bring an early end to the fighting in Gaza, alleviate the humanitarian catastrophe, and implement the two-state solution. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and I thank CDC Rattray for delivering the SG's briefing. 9 months since the 7 October attacks, at least 120 hostages, alive and dead, remain held in horrific conditions. Innocent Palestinians continue to suffer and die in Gaza. A devastating humanitarian crisis is worsening by the day. There is an imminent risk of famine, and we are deeply concerned about the risk of regional escalation, in particular along the blue line between Israel and Lebanon. President, in one of his first acts as UK Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer set out the urgent need for an immediate ceasefire, immediate release of all hostages, and an immediate surge of humanitarian aid into Gaza. We strongly support the ongoing efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to this end. The deal on the table, endorsed by this Council in Resolution 2735, is the best chance to support this. We urge both sides to show flexibility in negotiations and demonstrate a clear and firm commitment to ensure implementation of the deal. First, we're calling on Israel to protect civilians, to allow unfettered aid into Gaza, and to ensure the UN and humanitarian actors have the access and equipment necessary to safely get aid to those who need it most. We reaffirm our support for UNRWA and the vital role it plays in saving lives in Gaza, as well as providing basic services and promoting stability in the West Bank and the wider region, a fundamental building block for lasting peace. It is essential that UNRWA is able to operate on a sustainable financial basis and able to deliver on its mandate. Second, we express our serious concern at the escalating violence perpetrated by settlers in the West Bank. We condemn recent Israeli expansion of settlements. We reject decisions by the government of Israel to declare 2,357 hectares of land in the West Bank as state lands so far this year, the largest of such declarations of state land since the Oslo Accords. Such acts are not only illegal under international law, but also undermine prospects for a two-state solution. We demand a halt to these illegal activities. Third, there is no military solution to this conflict. Pursuing military options will only deepen divisions and perpetuate the suffering of Palestinians and Israelis. The civilian death toll in Gaza is unacceptable. Reports of civilian casualties following Israeli strikes near schools and designated humanitarian zones in Gaza in recent weeks were appalling. As the Foreign Secretary said, urgent measures are needed to protect civilians. We are appalled by the impact of the conflict on women and children. The UN estimates that there are over 17,000 unaccompanied children in Gaza, and over 5,000 women have been confirmed as killed, with many more unidentified or missing. Many of those killed and missing are mothers. Children are especially vulnerable to being killed, maimed, separated from their family, suffering trauma, acute malnutrition, violence, and exploitation. Women and girls in Gaza face a desperate struggle to access food and ensure basic hygiene, health, and dignity in the face of unfathomable sanitary conditions, rape, and conflict-related sexual violence. Peace will be sustainable only if both Israelis and Palestinians recommit to a renewed peace process resulting in a two-state solution, with safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state, the undeniable right of the Palestinian people. The UK Foreign Secretary's visit to the region this week signifies our unwavering commitment to this end. The UK Prime Minister has spoken with Prime Minister Netanyahu, President Abbas, and other regional leaders, underscoring the UK's commitment to play its full diplomatic role in securing a ceasefire deal and creating the space for a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution. The world needs a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Chef of the Cabinet, Rattray, for his briefing on behalf of the Secretary General. For more than 9 months, civilians in Palestine and Israel have experienced enormous suffering. This catastrophe must come to an end now. As Resolution 2735 demands, Hamas must accept the deal without further delay or more conditions, and both parties must faithfully implement it. A series of dismaying incidents have been repeatedly occurring, including an Israeli strike on a so-called safe zone in Al-Mawasi, reportedly killing more than 90 Palestinians. These recent attacks demonstrate once again that nowhere in Gaza is safe. We urge Israel to cease all attacks that lead to civilian casualties. When civilians are routinely killed and civilian infrastructure is habitually targeted, Israel is not doing what it describes as everything to protect civilians. As repeatedly stressed by all members of this Council, Israel must abide by its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. Israel must implement measures to abide by the rules of distinction, precaution, and proportionality. Hospitals, schools, places of worship, and humanitarian facilities must not be targeted under any circumstances. This is even more important as such facilities are being used as shelters of innocent and helpless civilians, many of whom have been forcibly displaced multiple times as a result of Israel's recurrent evacuation orders. At the same time, Hamas must also cease endangering Palestinian and Israeli civilians by using densely populated areas in Gaza as bases to launch rockets that target Israel. Humanitarian aid must not be hindered as famine spreads. In spite of the operationalization of the UN 2720 mechanism enhancing the management of humanitarian aid into Gaza, delivery of aid inside the Strip is nearly impossible, which is largely attributable to Israel's negligence of ensuring law and order in Gaza. Israel should open all available land crossings and exert every effort to maintain public order in Gaza, as well as protect humanitarian aid workers. We are also deeply alarmed by the ongoing deterioration of the situation in the West Bank. Since its adoption in 2016, Resolution 2334 has not been implemented, as Israel has expanded its settlement activities in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. It is particularly alarming that Israel has seized more land in the West Bank so far this year than in the past 20 years combined, which indicates the accelerating trend of settlement expansion. Military operations by Israeli forces in the West Bank, worsening settler violence, and the demolition of Palestinian homes are ever more troublesome as they are executed with near impunity. Inflammatory rhetoric and actions by Israeli high-level officials are adding fuel to the fire. We strongly urge Israel to stop all settlement activities, respect the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, and hold the perpetrators accountable. Mr. President, the entire Middle East is on the precipice of even more dangerous hostilities. The situation across the Blue Line is of utmost concern, with daily exchanges of fire between Israel and Hezbollah expanding in scope and intensity in total disregard of Resolution 1701. Hezbollah's armed presence in southern Lebanon is an ongoing violation of this resolution, and the traumatic experience of Israel of October 7 may have increased the hardline approach of the IDF across the Blue Line. This in turn further worsens the political and economic crisis in Lebanon, where 5 million Lebanese share their small land with around 2 million refugees, including 1.5 million Syrians. Recent worsening public sentiment in Lebanon due to the large number of Syrian refugees is another concerning factor that exacerbates regional instability. Continuous exchanges of fire across the blue line amid repeated warnings against a full-fledged war between Lebanon and Israel are also threatening the safety of UNIFIL, including the Republic of Korea's peacekeeping personnel. In addition, ongoing attacks against vessels by the Houthis in the Red Sea and repeated attacks between Israel and Syria also elucidate the dangerous escalation in the region. The entire world should exert its utmost efforts to avoid a full-scale regional war. We call for maximum restraint by all parties in the region, both national and non-state actors. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank the Russian Federation for organizing this meeting. I also extend our gratitude to Mr. Courtney Rattray for his insightful briefing. For over 9 months, the Israeli occupation aggressions against the defenseless Palestinian people has persisted, resulting in a devastating toll of casualties. Around 130,000 Palestinians have been martyred and wounded. The international community appears powerless to stop the relentless killing machine that targets innocent people in the street of Gaza. The suffering of the people of Gaza worsens daily. The Israeli occupying forces displace Palestinians for their homes, destroy their communities, and inflict death with impunity. We call for accountability. I repeat, we call for accountability. It is not an option. It is a must, and it matters. Unfortunately, the international community has yet to implement effective measures to stop these atrocities. This weekend's attack on displaced people in Al-Mawasi and the Shati, safe zones that become dead zones, along with the continued deliberate targeting of UNRWA schools, are clear evidence that Israeli occupation forces bluntly disregard the sanctity of human life. The international community seems paralyzed, held hostage by war criminals in the Israeli occupation government. These people thrive on Palestinian suffering and violate international law and humanitarian norms, using AIDS as a tool for pressure and bargaining. Palestinians now face famine as confirmed by UN reports. This is a war crime. The Security Council must take the necessary steps as outlined in Resolution 2417. The Israeli occupation violation of international law cannot be addressed with mere statements. It requires decisive sanctions to hold the occupation accountable. Mr. President, the provisional measures of the ICG were clear. The occupation authority must immediately provide essential services and humanitarian aid to Palestinians in Gaza. Instead, the occupation authorities have responded with more obstacles, targeting aid trucks and preventing UNRWA from carrying out its vital work. The Rafah crossing, which the court ordered to remain open, has been completely destroyed by the occupiers. The ongoing policies of ethnic cleansing and collective punishment against Palestinians marks the Security Council's inability to enforce its resolution. These resolutions remain words on paper, raising a crucial question those international law applies selectively. The Israeli occupation acts with impunity as if above the law. Mr. President, the time for unity is now. Let's us put aside difference and work towards an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and a lasting, just solution for Palestine. This solution must be based on international consensus, upholding the Palestinians' right to self-determination and the establishment of their independent state on their ancestral land, a fate that they decide for themselves. To conclude, as affirmed by the President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, Algeria, which paid a high price to restore its sovereignty and independence, will remain steadfast in supporting the Palestinian people until they obtain their full rights. Mr. President, the horrific image of killing and destruction that we see today in the occupied territories must mark the last chapter of Palestinian suffering. The lives lost, the bloodshed, must pave the way for an independent Palestinian state with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Russian Federation Presidency of the Security Council for convening this high-level open debate. I also thank the United Nations Secretary General for his comprehensive briefing led by the Chef de Cabinet, Mr. Courtney Rattray. It has been 283 days since the 7th of October 2023 attacks by Hamas and other armed groups on Israeli civilians, and the consequent response by the Israeli Defense Forces with bombardment and ground operations in the Gaza Strip. Approximately 1,200 died on the 7th October attacks, about 8,730 wounded, and 240 people, mostly Israeli, taken as hostages. About 120 are still being held as hostage. The Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict reported that based on the information gathered by our office's mission team from multiple and independent sources, there are reasonable grounds to believe that conflict-related sexual violence occurred during the 7th October attack in multiple locations around the Gaza periphery. The narration of the facts concerning the 7th of October 2023 attacks is followed by even more brutal human tragedy. Lest we forget, or we go quiet, or be numbed, the number of Palestinians killed in the Gaza Strip since the IDF ground operations and bombardment is more than 38,000, of which over 15,000 are children. Over 89,000 injured and 10,000 missing. In an area of 141 square miles, 1.9 million people internally displaced, with 9 out of 10 people estimated to be internally displaced multiple times. As of the 14th of July, 197 UNRWA personnel have been killed, and about 274 humanitarian aid workers have also been killed, as well as 500 healthcare workers. 458 incidents on UNRWA premises have been reported, and 189 UNRWA installations damaged. Access to full and unhindered humanitarian aid remains a challenge, owing to denials and delays by the IDF for coordinated movement and criminal gangs' attacks on humanitarian convoys. Karem Abu Salem, Karen Shalom crossing, which has been designated as a primary crossing for humanitarian cargo, is not fully operational due to active fighting and insecurity around the crossing, with the breakdown of public order due to the absence of law enforcement personnel. An estimated 30,000 pregnant women are facing acute levels of hunger. More than 10,000 are on the verge of famine, and close to 7,000 are in famine conditions. There exist major concerns regarding waste management, sewage control, and high risk of waterborne disease outbreak. The situation of women and children hinges on the lack of privacy and dignity, the increase in sexual-based violence and domestic abuse, such as of food, water, sanitary essentials. With the collective punishment, bombardment, acute level of hunger, Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have been robbed of their inherent human dignity. Mr. President, the situation in the Middle East Palestine question has been top of this Council's agenda for months, with a focus on ending the conflict in Gaza. The actions of the Security Council in the adoption of resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735 followed or were concurrent to the respective actions by United Nations Secretary General in invoking Article 99 of the UN Charter. The resolutions of the UN General Assembly, including ES 10/22, which call for an immediate ceasefire, immediate and unconditional hostage release, ensuring humanitarian access that all parties comply with their obligations under international law, as well as the provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice in South Africa versus Israel. Despite all of the cited actions, 9 months on, the narratives from the Gaza Strip remain horrendous. We have witnessed the refusal by the parties to the conflict to implement resolutions of this Council, the binding orders of the International Court of Justice, and comply with their obligations under international law. Sierra Leone joined the other Council members that voted in favor of SCR 2735 in good faith, on the assurance that a deal has been reached or imminent. Since the 10th of June 2024 adoption of SCR 2735, about 1,300 more Palestinians have been killed, with civilians and protected objects, in particular schools, directly targeted in missile strikes. The massive destruction of physical and critical infrastructure throughout the Gaza Strip, including water, sanitation, energy facilities, road and bridges, hospitals, schools, and residential homes, means that even after a ceasefire is achieved, recovery and reconstruction of Gaza will be a prolonged endeavor. This will pose an additional challenge for Palestinian authorities and the international community in restoring law and order and strengthening good governance. Mr. President, there are and there will not be any winners in this Israel-Palestine conflict. Continuation of the war in the Gaza Strip risks breeding a generation that is traumatized, uneducated, maimed, orphaned, homeless, and more dangerously aggrieved. There is also a generation that has been scarred by the unimaginable horrors of 7 October 2023 and overwhelmed with nightmares of the tunnels of Hamas. To change this narrative demands our collective and immediate action to secure lasting peace, but also end impunity and ensure accountability for the atrocity crimes being committed in this conflict. Increased settler activities and violence, military raids and detentions in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, heightened tensions between Israel and Lebanon across the Blue Line, and reported incidents in the Red Sea linked to the situation in Gaza further risk a regional spillover with their implications for global peace and security. In profiling a way forward to improve the current situation, we would like to make 3 points. Firstly, Sierra Leone reiterates the demand for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip and the entire occupied Palestinian territory, a legitimate call that has been echoed by this Council repeatedly. A ceasefire at this point will greatly improve the security situation in the Gaza Strip, curtail lawlessness and social disorder, guarantee the protection of civilians, and facilitate the unhindered passage of humanitarian relief to the millions of people in urgent need. Secondly, as emphasized in Resolution 2573, we underline the primary responsibility of the parties to the conflict to protect civilians and civilian objects, including humanitarian personnel and civilians engaged in duties related to the operation, maintenance, or repair of civilian infrastructure critical to the delivery of essential services to the civilian population in the Gaza Strip. We therefore condemn the recent attacks on UNRWA's headquarters and school housing displaced civilians from Khan Yunis and elsewhere, and the attack on the Al-Mawasi refugee camp, where it was reported that 90 Palestinians were killed, faithfully in a place considered to be a safe zone. Additionally, for accelerated and safe delivery of humanitarian relief to Gaza via all possible routes, we support calls for the establishment of effective, credible, and predictable deconfliction and coordination system across Gaza. Thirdly and lastly, addressing the fundamental issues fueling this conflict requires political will and commitment from Israel and Palestine to meaningfully engage in dialogue and negotiations towards a peaceful settlement to the dispute. While the political horizon of a two-state solution is the ultimate end, as an immediate solution, we continue to urge the parties to maintain good faith and positive attitude throughout the current negotiations brokered by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to ensure an agreement is reached in the shortest possible time. The fighting has gone on for long. The suffering of the people has been long. The recovery, reconstruction, and restoration of human dignity of the victims may take long, but it is time to give peace a chance, which must be persistently pursued. I thank you.
I thank Sierra Leone for their statement, and I now give the floor to Slovenia.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, I also want to thank Chief of Staff Rattray for delivering, as always, very clear message from the Secretary General. Mr. President, in his letter invoking Article 99 of the UN Charter last December, Secretary General underlined that hostilities created appalling human suffering, physical destruction, and collective trauma across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. He urged the Council to avert a humanitarian catastrophe last December. Not that we have not tried. We adopted 4 resolutions. None of them was adopted unanimously. None of them changed the situation on the ground. I'm certain a deep reflection on the role of the Council in this crisis is taking place among the members. Undoubtedly, several of us are reflecting on the disregard of international law, blatant violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. Among many deceptions we have been told in the recent months are also so-called safe zones. Instead of a humanitarian tool providing minimum protection standards, safe zone became a recurring target. We repeat what we said a few weeks ago. Neither Hamas nor Israel care about civilians. Hamas is hiding among the IDPs and thus endangering lives of their fellow Palestinians. While on the other side, Israel is showing complete disregard for the suffering of civilians in pursuit of Hamas. There is no moral equality between Israel and Hamas. However, the conduct of both actors against civilians is deplorable and constitutes a crime. Mr. President, while we are still struggling to prevent further deterioration of the humanitarian catastrophe, we need to pave the way for the restoration of the political horizon towards the two-state solution. We need to prevent future humanitarian catastrophes. There is Gaza beyond ceasefire. So let me offer some reflection on what could the Council steps be in that regard. Our first step includes immediate ceasefire. There must be full implementation of Security Council resolutions and ICJ orders on provisional measures. They are all binding and with clear demands for action, including release of hostages and aid delivery at scale. This will ensure the beginning of the end of colossal humanitarian and human suffering. We continue to offer full support and we commend the mediators, Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, for their efforts. Our second step could be a renewed political process leading to the two-state solution. Despite the absence of it, or perhaps especially because of it, the Council must reflect on the structure of the political process. Only a coherent approach backed by strong political will can provide a clear path forward. An international peace conference under the UN auspices would provide a platform for a revitalized exchange, and this would lead to a clear blueprint for Middle East peace process. This step is not only in the hands of the Security Council or the broader international community. Upholding the Charter is a responsibility of every UN member state. Appalling situation in Gaza is overshadowing the one in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, where we follow heightened tensions coupled with a rising death toll, a surge of settler attacks, and a dramatic settlement policy drive. In light of steps contradicting the two-state solution, we all need to take steps in its defense, collectively and individually. Our third step is rebuilding. Rebuilding as in reconstruction of Gaza. Rebuilding as in returning structure and public order to Gaza. Rebuilding as in supporting the return of the Palestinian Authority to Gaza. For this to happen, we need a strong Palestinian Authority, able to carry out its internal reform processes. Palestinian Authority able to access its tax revenues and bank accounts, and UNRWA supporting the transition period. Mr. President, this Council has to focus on the interest of those who matter the most and pay the highest price, people on the ground, civilians. There is no viable alternative to the renewed political process and prevention of a regional spiral of violence. With this in mind, we also call on all parties to show restraint along the blue line and commit to full implementation of the Resolution 1701. Parties must use the UNIFIL liaison and coordination mechanisms, good offices by international actors, and fully engage to de-escalate. Thank you.
I thank Slovenia for their statement, and I give the floor to Pan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank CDC Rattray for his briefing on behalf of the Secretary General. More than 9 months have passed since the outbreak of the devastating conflict in the Gaza Strip following the brutal acts of terror by Hamas and other militant groups. Japan deeply regrets the heavy civilian casualties and destruction caused by the ongoing hostilities. We are appalled last Saturday air strikes conducted by the IDF on a so-called safe zone in Al-Mawasi reportedly killed at least 90 people, and the next day, UNRWA's headquarters in Gaza was destroyed. Let me reiterate, all UN facilities, including UNRWA premises, must be protected at all times. These are just two notable examples of the many horrors happening regularly on the ground. Mr. President, all parties must strictly abide by the principles of international law, especially the protection of civilians. Hamas must stop using civilians as human shields. We also have grave concerns about the nearly 2 million internally displaced Palestinians, many having displaced multiple times with little or no access to food, clean water, medicine, and other basic human needs. In this vein, it is alarming to see yet another evacuation order by Israel for Khan Yunis and Gaza City. There are no safe places in Gaza. The killed, maimed, displaced, and struggling people are all human beings, not just numbers. Each of them has a life, family, dreams, and dignity. Mr. President, Japan takes note of Israel's claim that they have made some progress to reduce civilian casualties and facilitate humanitarian assistance to Gaza. and we acknowledge Israel's cooperation with Senior Humanitarian Reconstruction Coordinator Sigrid Kaag and other humanitarian agencies. But more must be done. Effective deconfliction mechanisms, reopening the Rafah crossing, full use of Ashdod port, and guaranteeing access and safety for UN and other humanitarian workers are all vital to accelerate necessary aid across the Gaza. The reality is the breakdown of order is making all aid operations extremely difficult or nearly impossible. Last month, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2735, endorsing the three-stage proposal which would pave the way for the release of hostages and sustainable ceasefire. Japan strongly supports the critical and tireless mediation of the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, and is encouraged to see renewed diplomatic push forward an agreement. We sincerely hope both parties seize this precious momentum and reach a much-needed deal without further delay. Mr. President, beyond Gaza, Japan condemns the recent decisions by the government of Israel regarding settlement expansion in the West Bank, as well as the rise in extremist settler violence. We call on Israel to reverse its decisions and prevent further violence immediately. In addition, while Japan takes note of the latest transfers of parts of clearance revenues by Israel to the Palestinian Authority, we urge Israel to release all withheld revenues and take necessary measures to maintain economic stability in the West Bank. Meanwhile, the escalation of hostilities along the Blue Line is also a matter of serious concern. Japan calls on both parties to exercise full restraint and cease hostilities based on the Resolution 1701. To conclude, only a two-state solution with Israel and Palestinians living side by side in peace and security will finally resolve this decade-long conflict. Japan remains steadfastly committed to achieving that goal. I thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю.
I thank Japan for their statement, and I give the floor to Mozambique.
Mr. President, Mozambique commends the Russian Federation for convening this open debate on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question, as a signature event of your presidency of the Security Council. We are grateful to the Secretary General of the United Nations for his briefing to the Council on the subject, delivered to us by the Chef de Cabinet, Mr. Courtney Rattray. Mr. President, reports on the recent events in the Middle East deepen our concerns over the aggravation of the already dramatic situation in Gaza and the region. The repeated attacks into Gaza by the Israeli armed forces, in which civilians, medical personnel, humanitarian workers, and journalists have been killed, deserve this Council's strong condemnation. We strongly believe this war must end now. It's time to bring it to a halt, and to this end, we reiterate our call on the parties to effectively implement Security Council resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728, 2724, and 2735 without further delay. Urgent action must be taken for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, for the release of all hostages, and for the delivery of humanitarian assistance to millions of Palestinians in need. We are concerned with the reports of constant evacuation orders on the population in Gaza. This gravely contravenes international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We are concerned that besides the Council's redoubled efforts, the situation on the ground is not improving. Attacks continue to cause civilian death, forced displacement, and aggravation of the humanitarian situation of Palestinians. Mozambique welcomes the diplomatic efforts by the United States and by Arab countries and the international community at large in search for a solution to the protracted conflict in the Gaza Strip and in Palestine. We call on Israel to comply with all Security Council resolutions and International Court of Justice orders on the matter. We express our full support to UNRWA, for it remains a pillar to assist millions of Palestinian refugees. We call on all donors to provide the agency with the necessary and predictable financial resources to operate and fulfill its mandate. Mr. President, Mozambique remains firm in our position of recognition of the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, political independence, and sovereignty as anchored in the Charter of the United Nations, in the principles and norms of international law. We reiterate the need for the implementation of a two-state solution, a solution of two independent and sovereign states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security, both as members of the United Nations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mozambique for their statement, and I give the floor to Malta.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Chef de Cabinet Rattray for delivering the Secretary General's briefing. The Middle East is going through an unprecedented period. As the war in Gaza rages on, it is having a ripple effect across the entire region, endangering civilians and upending any prospects for peace. This is why, following the horrific 7th October attacks by Hamas and other armed groups, Malta has unfailingly called for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. We continue to unequivocally condemn these heinous terrorist attacks and to call for the urgent and unconditional release of all remaining hostages in Gaza. It is imperative that Hamas and Israel accept and implement the ceasefire proposal outlined in the Security Council Resolution 2735. The implementation of all relevant Council resolutions and the full, immediate and effective implementation of the orders of the ICJ remains essential. Despite these clear obligations, we continue to witness further suffering in Gaza and beyond. Just last week, Israel ordered the forced displacement of all Palestinians from Gaza City. The recurring displacement of the population exacerbates the peril already faced by Palestinians. It also forces them into smaller areas where their safety, even in supposedly designated humanitarian zones, cannot be guaranteed. Malta is gravely alarmed at the effect this war is having on women. Harrowing accounts from the ground clearly show that we must do a lot more to ensure their dignity, privacy and safety. Children are also suffering in a disproportionate manner. Israel's bombing of schools and hospitals in which these most vulnerable seek refuge and treatment is unconscionable. Strikes on facilities sheltering IDPs have led to the killing of children. This is unacceptable. Children must never be considered as justifiable collateral damage. Young children and pregnant women are at additional acute risk of disease and malnourishment due to a decimated healthcare system, persistent food insecurity, and no access to clean water. These conditions put children, newborns, and pregnant women in significant peril, and are not in line with their unique protections under international law. All parties have an obligation under international law, including international humanitarian law, to protect civilians. Accountability for violations of these obligations must be ensured. Furthermore, we reiterate that humanitarian access into and across the Gaza Strip must be drastically improved. Land crossings must be reopened and fully utilized. An effective and respected deconfliction system is a priority. Let us never forget that humanitarians risk their lives on a daily basis and must be protected at all times. It is the duty of this Council to ensure that they are provided with the tools and protection they need to at least mitigate the extreme risks they face. We commend the efforts of UNRWA and other humanitarian actors which contribute to provide support at all costs. UNRWA has a vital role to play in the humanitarian response in Gaza and the West Bank and for regional stability. In the face of threats to its facilities and mandate, financial and political support to the agency are vital. President, preventing a spillover of escalation in the Middle East is paramount. This is crucial in the face of increasingly alarming skirmishes between Israel and Hezbollah across the Blue Line. De-escalation, restraint, and diplomacy are key. Israel's illegal unilateral actions in the West Bank, including the recent announcement of further settlements and the continued dispossession and violence imposed on Palestinians, also needs to cease. These actions exacerbate tensions and threaten the viability of a two-state solution. Military raids in West Bank refugee camps, along with a surge in extremist settler violence, further impede peace progress. Furthermore, the Palestinian Authority must enjoy the full support of the international community in its path towards revitalization for the effective governance over a unified West Bank and Gaza as an independent Palestinian state. It also has a crucial role to play in recovery and reconstruction efforts in Gaza. Challenges towards ensuring peace for Israelis and Palestinians persist, but we must not let this extinguish all hope. A ceasefire in Gaza is the first step towards paving the way for a credible political horizon. Malta affirms that this must then be followed by irreversible actions towards the comprehensive realization of a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as the future capital of two states living side by side in peace and security, in line with all relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. I thank you.
Я благодарю Мальту за их заявление.
I thank Malta for their statement, and I give the floor to Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. I should like to thank the Chef de Cabinet of the Secretary General, Courtney Rattray, for the briefing presented this morning on behalf of the Secretary General, and once again express my country's support for his work. I also greet the high-level ministers and delegates who are participating in this open debate today. Over 9 months have already gone by since the terrorist attacks of the 7th of October. The violence and destruction have occurred on a daily basis since then. The humanitarian situation in Gaza continues to be critical, despite all efforts. A few days ago, last weekend, further strikes were launched on a designated safe zone in Al-Mawasi, causing dozens of victims and many injured. We wish to recall the obligation upon all the parties to respect the principles of international humanitarian law, which include proportionality and distinction, and to make every effort to protect civilians. Colleagues, at the beginning of June, the Council adopted Resolution 2735, which supported a ceasefire proposal which is still under negotiation, despite the parties being urged to accept it and implement it without delay nor condition. If an agreement had been reached already, the hostilities would have stopped. The hostages would have been released. Humanitarian aid could have been delivered in a safe, sufficient and timely manner, and we would not be deploring still more victims. Unfortunately, it has not yet been possible to reach this agreement, and in this meeting, I must home in on messages which are as well known as they are necessary. I therefore reiterate Ecuador's condemnation of the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October, and of acts of violence against civilians and violations of international humanitarian law. I also repeat, and I very much hope for the last time, the request for an immediate ceasefire and the unconditional and also immediate release of the hostages. I also stress our support for the efforts to achieve an agreement and thank the United States, Qatar and Egypt for their determination and perseverance. I urge the parties to also exhibit their goodwill and flexibility to finally bring an end to the violence and start down the road towards peaceful coexistence. President, colleagues, this road to peaceful coexistence is threatened not only by the war in Gaza, but also by acts and decisions which undermine the viability of the two-state solution, such as the legalization of settlements in the West Bank or the hobbling of the financing and functioning of the Palestinian Authority. It is therefore necessary to reiterate once again the call to uphold and fully implement Resolution 2334 and all the resolutions of this Council. If the parties, rather than exhibiting restraint and good faith, opt to exacerbate the conflict and scorn the paths for a peaceful solution, all they will achieve is to perpetuate the mutual mistrust and increased insecurity. Colleagues, I conclude with another oft-repeated and yet still necessary message. A message of support for a peaceful, negotiated, definitive and just solution for the parties, with the existence of two states, Palestine and Israel, upon the basis of the 1967 borders and the relevant resolutions. A message of support to those who believe in a future of peace. I thank you.
I thank Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to France. Mr. President, the most recent developments in the Near and Middle East are a reminder of the urgent need to halt the current escalation. In Gaza, as French President Emmanuel Macron has said, there is an urgent need to reach an agreement on a ceasefire that guarantees the protection of all civilians, unhindered humanitarian access, and the release of all hostages. The resolutions adopted by this Council must finally be implemented. France reiterates its solidarity with the Israeli people following the terrorist attacks of October 7th and its commitment to Israel's security. France expresses its outrage following the Israeli strikes that targeted an UNRWA school and the Al-Maghazi camp for displaced persons on July 14th and 15th. We continue to call on Israel to do its utmost to protect civilians in its conduct of military operations and to respect international law, in particular the principles of proportionality and distinction. Settlement activity which violates international law and the cycle of violence in the West Bank must come to an end. The settlers who commit attacks against the Palestinian population must be held accountable. France condemns the recent Israeli settlement decisions, in particular the recognition of 5 new settlements and the construction of 5,000 additional housing units. There is an urgent need to achieve a political settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the basis of the two-state solution. We are determined to play our full part in efforts to achieve this. France is also gravely concerned by the ongoing clashes along the blue line between Lebanon and Israel. We call on all parties to exercise the utmost restraint in order to prevent a regional conflagration, the consequences of which would be disastrous. This council must be able to unanimously call for a de-escalation. France also recalls that these clashes threaten UNIFILs whose capacity to act and security must be protected. France reiterates its commitment to the security of Lebanon, Israel, and the region, as well as Lebanon's sovereignty and the full implementation of Resolution 1701. France will continue its efforts to promote a diplomatic solution. In Yemen, the Houthis must cease attacks in the Red Sea, which constitute a violation of international law. They must commit in good faith to the peace process under the auspices of the UN Special Envoy. Iran, which is financing and arming the Houthis, must cease its destabilizing actions. We call for the release of UN and non-governmental organization personnel detained by the Houthis. In Syria, only a political solution based on Resolution 2254 can bring peace in a context of increasingly heightened tensions across Syria, the resurgence of Daesh, the rising Captagon trafficking, and a deterioration of the humanitarian situation. In the face of rising tensions in the Middle East, France is mobilized in favor of a rapid de-escalation in conjunction with its regional and international partners. I thank you. I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the Acting Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Islamic Republic of Iran, His Excellency Mr. Ali Bagheri.
In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful, Mr. President, I would like to thank the Russian Federation for organizing this timely open debate. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, over the past 285 days, the Israeli occupying regime has been committing extensive international crimes in Gaza. This regime, through a campaign of brutality and terror, continues to massacre innocent people, mostly women and children. In this deadly campaign, about 20 people are killed or injured every hour. The Israeli regime has destroyed over 80% of residential areas and all infrastructure, including hospitals, mosques, churches, educational centers, and historical sites in Gaza. This regime has brutally weaponized starvation as a means of war by blocking the aid routes, bombing the refugee camps in Rafah, and attacking the displaced people in Khan Yunis are just two examples of these recent inhumane crimes. Despite the global condemnation of the genocide and war crimes committed by the Israeli regime in Gaza and the unanimous and united call of the international community for an immediate end to genocide and massacre of Gaza's people, immediate and permanent ceasefire, and delivery of humanitarian aid, which have been reflected in 4 UN Security Council resolutions, numerous statements by international organizations, 3 provisional measures of the ICJ, and widespread protests, the Zionist occupying regime continues its brutal crimes against Palestine with full impunity. Mr. President, distinguished audience, recently the warmongering leaders of this regime have been under the illusion that expanding the war to Lebanon can save them from the quagmire of Gaza. This is an absurd and dangerous miscalculation and exacerbates the already chaotic situation in this sensitive region to spiral out of control. In this chamber and from this podium, I would like to strongly warn against any adventurous action by this rogue regime and its consequences. Undoubtedly, any aggression against Lebanon as an independent member state of the United Nations by the Zionist regime decisive and disappointing response from the international community, the nations of the region, and the resistance groups. It is evident that the responsibility of the United States as a strategic ally and main supporter of the regime in the region cannot be denied in the face of any potential aggression by the regime against Lebanon. Mr. President, the recent support of the regional countries to the Palestinian resistance stems from the inhumane crimes of the Israeli regime in Gaza, which have been going since 1948. More than 9 months of massive attacks by the Israeli regime on Gaza and the West Bank prove that destruction of the Palestinian resistance and Hamas as a liberation movement established against occupation and aggression is nothing more than an illusion. The support of all the nations of the region and the freedom seekers of the world to the praiseworthy resistance of the Palestinian nation also prove that this nation is not at all alone in realizing its inherent right. Israel is not a legitimate state. It is only an occupying regime, and the passage of time does not and will not give legitimacy to the occupying regime, because, based on the well-known principles of international law, occupation of a land or territory is temporary, even if it lasts for decades. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the only way to restore peace is to put an immediate, complete, and permanent end to the occupation, aggression, and crimes committed by this regime. The UN Security Council has the responsibility to achieve this goal, and regrettably, the inaction and inability of the Security Council over the past nearly 8 years has emboldened the Israeli regime to commit more crimes against the oppressed people of Palestine. We strongly call for rectifying these historical failures and fulfilling the Council's legal, political, and human duty, especially by permanent members of the UN Security Council. In this context, the responsibility of the United States is even heavier. This country, with approximately 50 vetoes and extensive support to the Israeli regime, has not only played a role in this major failure of the Council, but has also been a primary accomplice in the crimes and aggressions committed by this notorious and criminal regime through comprehensive financial, military, and intelligence support. Therefore, the U.S. claim to promote peace and stability in the region and its mediating efforts to establish a ceasefire are hypocritical. Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran reiterates its call for a decisive action by the UN Security Council. We urge this Council to take the necessary measures based on its duties under the United Nations Charter, including adopting a comprehensive and legally binding resolution under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter to compel the Israeli regime to immediately and unconditionally end genocide and aggression against Gaza, implement a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and open border crossings for the rapid and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid. The Security Council must also compel the Israeli regime to immediately, fully, and unconditionally withdraw its military and security forces from Gaza, lift the siege of Gaza, stop the forced displacement of people, halt illegal settlement activities, and provide full and immediate compensation for all damages inflicted on the people, infrastructure, residential areas, and similar cases in Gaza and other Palestinian territories to facilitate the rapid reconstruction of Gaza. This regime must also withdraw from all occupied Palestinian, Syrian, and Lebanese territories and refrain from any military attacks on Lebanon or other countries in the region. Furthermore, the international community and competent international organizations must ensure that all the commanders, perpetrators, and supporters of Israel's crimes in Gaza and other Palestinian territories are prosecuted and punished. The Islamic Republic of Iran has always been a positive element in regional developments, stabilizing sustainable peace and security, including the fight against terrorism. In contrast, the Israeli regime has been the main source of regional insecurity, and the malicious activities of this regime have always posed a serious threat to regional and global peace and security. The nature and essence of the occupying Israeli regime are based on aggression, occupation, terror, and genocide. This regime and its notorious prime minister, for whom the ICC has requested an arrest warrant on charges of war crimes, have always attempted to accuse others by resorting to a campaign of lies and misinformation. The Security Council must hold the rogue and rebellious Israeli regime accountable and put an end to the roots of war and genocide in Gaza and insecurity in the region. Mr. President, in conclusion, I reaffirm the inalienable right of the regional nations, including the Palestinian people, to defend and resist occupation and aggression. The Islamic Republic of Iran maintains that a comprehensive, fair, and lasting solution to the Palestinian question is only possible by ending the occupation of all Palestinian territories, allowing the Palestinian people to realize their right to self-determination through holding a referendum among all the regional inhabitants of Palestine and establishing an independent and unified state of Palestine. This is the only viable way to establish durable peace and security in the West of Asia region. I thank you very much.
Кирикяне. И сейчас я предоставляю слово министру иностранных дел Бахрейна, его превосходительству господину Абдел-Латифу бен Рашиду аз-Заини. Прошу вас.
In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, Your Excellency, the President of the Council, Your Excellencies, Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished attendees, at the outset, I would like to express my sincere appreciation for devoting this meeting to discussing the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. I thank you for inviting me to speak before the Council on behalf of my country, the Kingdom of Bahrain, which presides over the current session of the League of Arab States. Mr. President, over the past decades, the Middle East region has suffered from destructive wars, conflicts, and bitter conflicts, which have caused great loss of lives, of property, and infrastructure, which have left behind painful humanitarian tragedies and violated international laws and conventions. They have become a major threat to regional security and stability and present serious risks to international peace and security. It is essential upon the international community and the Security Council especially to intensify efforts to arrive at sustainable solutions to all conflict, that especially those that have become protracted in the region, and to work on establishing a just and lasting peace that preserves the rights of all peoples to life, freedom, dignity, and coexistence in a space of tolerance and human coexistence. And despite the commendable efforts that are made by the international community to bring peace to the Middle East, including resolutions adopted by the esteemed Council and the United Nations General Assembly, the Madrid Peace Conference, the Oslo Accords, the Camp David Summit, and the Arab Peace Initiative, unfortunately, these efforts have not achieved peace and stability in the region, and the peoples of the region continue to suffer greatly from bloodshed, from displacement, from being refugees, and from being deprived of the necessities of life. The hope for a better future is fading. Mr. President, the painful tragedy experienced by Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip over the past 9 months is immense and intolerable, not only because of the lives lost, but also as a result of their deprivation of food, water, medicine, health care, education, and the most basic of services. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a moral stain on the entire world, and it must end. And it must do so in a way that provides immediate assistance to civilians in Gaza and ensures the release of hostages and detainees, and in a manner that leads to lasting peace and security in the region. As the war on the Gaza Strip continues, the entire Middle East region today stands at a crossroads. One path leads to deepening and expanding the conflict across the region. It is a path that draws some actors, state and non-state actors. It draws them into an open-ended and multifaceted conflict that will only bring more destruction, misery, and wasted potential. The other path is one that calls for a resolution to the conflict in a manner that does not simply lead to an immediate ceasefire and the provision of humanitarian assistance and the release of hostages and detainees, but one that is a comprehensive and sustainable solution that takes into consideration other essential matters such as reconstruction, administrative governance, security arrangements after the ceasefire, and within the context of efforts made to reach a comprehensive and lasting solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. A solution that would naturally deliver peace, security, and stability for all the countries and peoples of the Middle East. Mr. President, the 33rd Arab Summit that was held in the Kingdom of Bahrain last May, under the chairmanship of His Majesty King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa, King of the Kingdom of Bahrain. That summit reaffirmed the firm Arab position on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and proved beyond any doubt that Arab states have collectively adopted the second path, the path of a just and lasting peace, as an irreplaceable strategic option if we are to achieve our humanitarian objectives in the battle for peace. And in its capacity as the president of the 33rd session of the League of Arab States, the Kingdom of Bahrain participates in today's meeting of the Council, and we have come to reaffirm the full solidarity of the Arab states and their unwavering commitment to peace. The Bahrain Declaration adopted by the summit affirmed the unified Arab position, calling for a just and comprehensive, peaceful resolution of the Palestinian question, and calling for irreversible steps to implement the two-state solution in accordance with the resolutions of international legitimacy and to guarantee the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people to establish their independent, sovereign, and viable national state. The Bahrain summit was a message of peace and solidarity to the whole world. The summit adopted a number of important initiatives. Most notably, it called for convening an international conference for peace in the Middle East to resolve the Palestinian issue on the basis of the two-state solution. The Kingdom of Bahrain expressed its readiness to host such a conference. It also supports the full recognition of the State of Palestine and its admission to full membership in the United Nations, providing educational and health services to those affected by conflicts and wars in the region. This must be done in cooperation and coordination with international and regional organizations and develop Arab cooperation in the field of fintech innovation and digital transformation. The peace process that involves only the direct parties or a limited number of parties cannot achieve broader regional engagement, an engagement which is essential to providing a stable and sustainable environment in the Middle East that brings peace, security, and prosperity and opportunities to all its countries and peoples. Mr. President, here and from this esteemed international forum, I would like to commend what was announced by His Majesty King Charles III, King of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and head of the Commonwealth, when inaugurating the British Parliament this morning, in that His Majesty said that the British government will work on playing its part in guaranteeing peace and security on the long term in the Middle East, and that it is committed to the two-state solution where Israel would live in secured borders side by side with a Palestinian state that enjoys sovereignty. Mr. President, esteemed members of the Council, ladies and gentlemen, we are convinced that the international community today faces a genuine historic opportunity to achieve peace, security, and stability in the Middle East, and to successfully fulfill its mandate and responsibilities in the region, as has happened in other similar conflicts in the world. And through working with the Security Council and the General Assembly and member states individually, I believe that we are able to forge an international coalition of nations willing to achieve real peace and stability and prosperity in the Middle East. And at this difficult historical juncture, we can unite efforts not only to overcome the immediate challenge and end the horrific violence and suffering in the Gaza Strip, but also to shape the future that the Middle East and its peoples deserve. Therefore, and in the context of the urgent need for an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, which we reaffirm, and the need to provide full humanitarian assistance to the civilian population and release hostage detainees, and in affirmation of the common Arab commitment to peace as a strategic option based on the two-state solution, allow me to urge your esteemed Council and the international community as a whole to work seriously and effectively with Arab states to end this long-standing conflict and deliver a better future for the Middle East region and their peoples. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Zaini for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Immigrants of Lebanon, His Excellency Mr. Abdallah Bouhabib.
Said Rais,
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, we are meeting again today at the Security Council to discuss the volatile situation in the Middle East, which has lasted more than 9 months, with the kind invitation of the Russian Federation. The conflict has widened, conditions have deteriorated, and the ball of fire rages on after the international community has been unable to date to implement United Nations resolutions aimed at a ceasefire in Gaza, the exchange of prisoners and hostages, and the entry of aid, medicine, and life-sustaining food into the Gaza Strip. In recent months, Lebanese officials have been given several warnings about the danger of the expansion of the war into Lebanon. We have also heard dozens of statements by senior Israeli officials threatening to burn Lebanon, destroy it, and blow it back to the Stone Age. From this rostrum, we renew our warning of miscalculation, brinkmanship, and dragging the entire region towards an explosive situation. From this rostrum also, we reiterate our rejection of the war and our efforts through contacts and meetings to avoid falling into the trap of Israeli recklessness, which seeks to continue the war and expand its geographical scope. This war, if it happens, will shake the entire Middle East. It will be transboundary, and it will lead to a new displacement crisis from which Europe will not be spared, not only from Lebanon and Israel, but also from neighboring countries fleeing missiles, drones, and warplanes. It will also lead to destruction, devastation, and misery for the entire region, and the lack of opportunities for a dignified life for its peoples and residents, which means further migration and displacement. Hence, Lebanon, a geographically small state, a state big in its global reach, culture, and history, is increasingly upholding international legitimacy and is protected by its decisions. For Lebanon, the United Nations will remain the line of defense that shelters us and the last refuge from the logic of violence and occupation. Today, we are in a dire need for the role of the UN as a refuge of peace-loving small countries, including Lebanon. Mr. President, at the Security Council meeting on the situation in the Middle East on the 23rd of January, we have put forward an integrated framework for sustainable calm on Lebanon's southern border. Today, we reiterate our call for a ceasefire to move forward towards full and undiminished implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701, which has proven its ability to establish relative stability in southern Lebanon since the end of the July 2006 war and until the 7th of October 2023. The shortest way for tens of thousands of displaced persons from both sides to return to their homes is not through the threat of war or opening another front, but through the full and comprehensive implementation of Resolution 1701 as part of an integrated basket with clear and declared international guarantees to promote sustainable calm and security in southern Lebanon as per the following. 1. Facilitate the rapid and safe return of displaced persons from the border areas from which they were displaced after October the 7th, 2023, and the return to normal life in all border villages and towns. 2. a definitive cessation of Israeli violations by air, land, and sea of Lebanon's sovereignty and its internationally recognized borders, which have exceeded 35,000 since the year 2006. 3. Ceasing carrying out cyber attacks that threaten the security and safety of networks, devices, applications, and electronic data in facilities and vital Lebanese facilities, especially Rafik Hariri International Airport, which threatens public safety and adversely affects its work and functionality. 4. Support by the UN and friendly countries, the Lebanese government to deploy the Lebanese army south of the Litani River and provide it with the necessary equipment to augment its ranks so that there would be no weapon without the approval of the government and would be no authority except the authority of the government of Lebanon in accordance with Resolution 1701. 5. Marking Lebanon's internationally recognized borders that have been marked between Lebanon and Palestine in 1923, which have been stressed in the Lebanese-Israeli armistice agreement signed in the Greek island of Rhodes in 1949 under the auspices of the UN. This would be done through completing the process of agreeing on the 13 disputed border points. As such, Israel would withdraw from all Lebanese territory that it continues to occupy to reach internationally recognized borders. 6. Adherence to and commitment to the UNIFIL forces in southern Lebanon, as it has been a factor for calm and stability in the region. And this is despite the major sacrifices and the challenges, particularly in recent months. Hence, last month, we have submitted a request for the renewal of UNIFIL's mandate without any modification on the current mandate. We look forward to working and cooperating with all members of the Security Council to achieve this, since this is a pivotal issue and UNIFIL is central in its role. Mr. President, we have demanded an end to the war in Gaza and an end to the escalation in southern Lebanon. To date, Israel continues to refuse a ceasefire on our southern border, and it has sought to keep this front a hotspot, and it continues to expand the scope of its aggression and burning thousands of ancient olive trees and polluting agricultural land with white phosphorus so that it would be unarable land, which deprives farmers in southern Lebanon from their main and perhaps only source of livelihood, which feeds hatred, extremism, and canceling others at a time when we are in a serious need for calm, de-escalation, and stability. The hotspot front on our southern border is because of the continued war in Gaza. Palestine will remain the key to stability in the Middle East. And despite the tragedy today in Gaza, we need to cooperate together so that this would be a historic opportunity to chart a future that is better for future generations in all the countries of the region. It has been 67 years since the UN resolution was adopted to establish two states in historic Palestine. Only one of those two states has been established. Peace in our region will not be achieved before the establishment of the promised Palestinian state in line with relevant UN resolutions, particularly resolutions 242 and 338 of 1967. And the Arab Peace Initiative of the 2002 Arab Summit held in Beirut based on the principle of land for peace, namely the two-state solution. The recognition of the right of the Palestinian people to free and decent life on their territory is the key to peace, security, and prosperity for all the countries of the Middle East. Mr. President, the microphone has been cut off. The sound is back, the interpreter notes. Double standards in the application of international laws and resolutions, especially those adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, the Security Council, and specialized international organizations, constitute an existential challenge to our global system, its foundation and pillars. In the occupied Palestinian territory, namely East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, we deplore what we see as taking lightly international will and the way UN resolutions are addressed. Furthermore, there are flagrant violations of international law and human rights. The right to live in dignity, freedom, and the right to medicine, education, housing, and food for Palestinians are basics of human life in the 21st century. So, how is an entire people left to the whims of the occupier to die because of disease, hunger, and thirst? Hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians are children, women, and the elderly. They have committed no fault except that they were born and they have lived, and they are dying every day under occupation. In closing, we are committed to optimism and hope, to ensuring a dignified and free coexistence and the constant pursuit of stability, peace, and security, no matter how long it takes. We are not seeking cancellation, killing, and displacement. We in Lebanon have paid the highest price as a result of the wars that we have suffered, and we have tasted its bitterness. We have paid the highest prices to defend and advocate for the rights of Palestine and its people, and we still are paying the highest price, sometimes beyond our capacity. We come today to call on you to give peace a chance after decades of conflict and occupation. Aren't 76 years enough? Wars, killing, and tragedies. Aren't we going to learn from this bitter past? Aren't we going to give peace a chance? Isn't it time? Let's start this long journey of 1,000 miles by applying the last 4 UN resolutions on the war in Gaza, the most recent of which is Resolution 2735, in order to stop the machine of violence and destruction, return to the path of peace, and a just and final solution to the Palestinian question. Isn't it time yet, after suffering and tragedy, to build a better future for all of the peoples of our region? I thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Bouhabib, for his statement, and now give the floor to the Acting Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Libya, His Excellency Mr. Al-Tahir Salem El-Bauer.
In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, Mr. President, allow me at the outset to congratulate you on the Security Council during the current month, and we thank you for inviting us to take part in today's meeting. Despite the repeated calls and the many meetings that were convened by the international community and the United Nations, the world continues to witness on a daily basis more massacres, new massacres perpetrated by the occupying entity in populated areas, attacks that have killed many elderly persons, children, women, under the excuse of targeting Hamas locations and their leaders and related resistance factions. Reports indicate that the massacre of Al-Mawasi, which was previously identified as a humanitarian zone to shelter displaced persons. That recent massacre, and according to the World Health Organization, has left behind hundreds of those killed and wounded and many more missing. More than 9 months have passed since the start of the Zionist aggression, and it is shameful that Security Council and International Committee resolutions and resolutions by the Human Rights Council and the ICJ and the demands made by the international community continue to be merely words on paper and have not stopped the Zionist entity from perpetrating its crimes, and it continues in its barbarism and attacks every day. The massacres against the Palestinian people have now become ordinary news items in news bulletins, and the international community stands and watches, simply issuing statements of condemnation that change nothing on the ground. Mr. President, it is known that genocide and ethnic cleansing that is being perpetrated by the occupying entity against the Palestinian people and the systemic barbaric practices it is practicing have gone beyond all international norms and limits and has gone beyond even the law of the jungle and clearly violates all international conventions and laws. We strongly reject what our brothers and sisters in Palestine are being subjected to in terms of killing and destruction and eviction, and we reject the double standards being practiced by someone dealing with the Palestinian question, and the fact that they ignore the ugly and heinous crimes being perpetrated against the Palestinians. Some of them have even offered justifications and participated and encouraged these crimes by furnishing the occupying entity with weapons to kill unarmed civilians. Human values and international laws cannot be segmented or customized to meet the interests of the strong and to crush the weak and helpless. And despite the fact that the Security Council issued a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire to save the lives of innocents and calling on all parties to abide by it and by international law, however, the absence of political will has made it impossible to stop this bloodshed. At the same time, we reject and we warn of expanding the scope of this war inside Lebanese territory, and we strongly condemn the use of internationally banned weapons. Mr. President, my country has joined South Africa and a number of other states in the lawsuit submitted to the ICJ to bring justice to the Palestinian people and defend their right to live peacefully on their own land. And we once again demand that the Security Council abide by the implementation of its resolutions and relevant resolutions for a ceasefire and for the provision of urgent and unconditional aid, and to find a resolution to the question in accordance with the initiatives issued by the League of Arab States and the most recent U.S. initiative that confirm the need for a lasting peace through the two-state solution. In closing, there is no doubt that the Palestinian people have the right to determine their own destiny, just like other peoples. And the Palestinian people have every right to defend themselves. Their cause is just, and years of struggle and attempts at reaching settlements in accordance with international resolutions and terms of reference have proven that a solution can only be achieved through dealing with the root causes and through acknowledging and recognizing the Palestinian people's inalienable rights, including and foremost the right to establish an independent state with Al-Quds al-Sharif at its capital. And here we affirm and confirm the Palestinian state's right to full membership in the United Nations as a step towards a just solution that is comprehensive and that achieves equality between the countries and peoples of the world. I thank you, sir.
I thank His Excellency Mr. El-Bauer for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Kuwait, His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Ali Al-Yahya.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Sayyid al-Rais.
In the name of God, the most merciful. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I greet you. At the outset, I wish to reiterate my gratitude to the Russian Federation holding the presidency of the Council at this delicate time and their organization of this meeting to discuss important developments in the occupied Palestinian territory. I also thank the representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations for the excellent presentation just provided. We appreciate his efforts and constructive role in this field. President, our meeting today is being held whilst we are seeing with great pain the continued military operations by the Israeli Defense Forces in occupied Palestinian territory. The entry of the Israeli occupiers into the Gaza Strip enters into its 10th month now. This shows a bleak landscape of destruction in humanitarian terms, and there are 40,000 dead and over 88,000 injured, mostly women and children. The total number of victims lying under the rubble is unknown. Catastrophic humanitarian losses in the Gaza Strip has been accompanied by unprecedented destruction. The incursions by the occupying authority, its strikes throughout occupied Palestinian territory have ruined the houses, turned schools into battlefields, hospitals into landscapes of pain and powerlessness. And despite the United Nations' efforts to bring an end to these attacks, the occupying authority continues its persistent stubbornness, arrogance, and ignores all calls for a ceasefire. It continues to cut short lives without any distinction. It is clear that these operations have no military objective. These operations aim to systematically destroy and terrorize Palestinians, to wipe out their existences and bring an end to the question. This is a barbaric act which calls into question all levels of humanity. The Israeli authorities, in ignoring all international laws, international humanitarian law included, aiming to besiege the Palestinian people and place them before a reality of either accepting this violence and renouncing their territory and their legitimate rights, or facing genocide and ethnic cleansing until the total elimination of their project occurs. This is a war crime and a crime against humanity. The state of Kuwait expresses its cooperation and its condemnation, rather, of these crimes and support for the Palestinian people in their land. We demand that the international community continues to take all necessary measures to bring an end to these attacks, which have claimed tens of thousands of innocent victims, to bring an end to displacements. This is ethnic cleansing. We call for them, allow for humanitarian assistance to be delivered unconditionally and unhindered. We congratulate in this regard and reiterate the role of UNRWA, the importance of the role of UNRWA. It is essential in supporting the Palestinian people at their darkest hour and the most difficult times. President, Kuwait has often warned of the repercussions regarding the way in which the international Commission of Inquiry is looking, the international community is treating this situation with double standards. They are unable to reach a just, global and definitive solution to this question and have had to postpone and unable to prevent the unilateral actions, to prevent the legal status, and the Security Council's incapacity to assume its responsibilities. The international community's avoidance of the Security Council resolutions has all led to a situation of despair in the minds of all the future generations as well, who only wish to live in a dignified and safe manner in their country, like all other peoples. By way of conclusion, the State of Kuwait reiterates its position of principle, one of solidarity with regard to the Palestinian people, a kindred people, for them to recover their legitimate rights, including the construction of an independent state within the 1967 borders. We are attached to the choice of just, enduring peace within the parameters of international relevant resolutions, and we support all international efforts and initiatives to reach a just and lasting solution to the Palestinian question, with the repercussions that this will have in terms of international peace, security, and development for the region. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Eliahi for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of Thailand, His Excellency Mr. Ras Jalichandra.
Mr. President, I wish to thank the Russian Federation for convening this quarterly open debate. It has been 10 months since the conflict began. Thailand remains gravely concerned over the deterioration of the humanitarian situation in the area. During these months, we have seen widespread hunger and famine, the collapse of the healthcare and educational systems, and the loss of more than 34,000 innocent civilian lives. As hostilities continue intensively, the already dire humanitarian crisis has worsened in Gaza, and there has been a very high cost of human lives. We repeat our call for the immediate, full, and complete ceasefire. We are also concerned about the heightened risk of conflict assuming a more regional dimension. It is thus an urgent issue for the Security Council to prevent this. In this regard, the adoption of the Security Council's Resolution 2735 in June this year was a major step forward. We appeal to all parties to implement this resolution as well as other relevant Security Council resolutions. We also urge all sides to comply with their obligations under the international law, including international humanitarian law. This entails ensuring the protection of civilians and civilian objects, humanitarian access, and the protection of humanitarian personnel and their freedom of movement, and the provision of urgently needed basic humanitarian services and humanitarian assistance. Protection of civilians must be a priority at all times. We oppose all forms of violence and attacks against civilians, regardless of their nationalities. We also call for the protection of UN staff and UN premises, hospitals, and public buildings. We reiterate our plea for the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages, including Thai nationals, as well as their proper treatment and care pending their release. We emphasize the need to ensure the uninterrupted humanitarian assistance to Gaza. We wish to commend Ms. Sigrid Kark, Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, and her team for their unwavering dedication and efforts to facilitate and support the work of all humanitarian partners on the ground to alleviate the plight of the Palestinians. We reiterate our continued support for such efforts. We also commend the work being done by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in Near East as the backbone of aid response in Gaza. Recognizing the irreplaceable role of the UNRWA, Thailand joins the Secretary General and other member states in appealing to the international community to resume or continue support for the UNRWA. Thailand has recently provided an additional $50,000 in financial contribution to the second UNRWA flash appeals for the occupied Palestinian territory, covering the period from April to December 2024. We also donate another $100,000 to the Egyptian Red Crescent to support humanitarian assistance for Palestinian refugees. Thailand hopes that our contribution will help enable UNRWA to continue its mandate for the benefit of the Palestinian refugees in response to the current humanitarian situation. Thailand reaffirms our support for genuine dialogue to find a mutually agreed, peaceful solution to the issue in accordance with the two-state solution by which the state of Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace and security within secure and recognized borders and inconsistent with relevant UNSC resolutions. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Jalichandra for his statement. There are still a number of speakers remaining on my list for this meeting. I intend, with the concurrence of members of the Council, to suspend the meeting until 3 p.m. The meeting is suspended.